Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to the third in our series of talks on towersoffaith.com, a place for us to share the inspiration, the encouragement, the passion that we have for those people that have helped us deepen our faith, have helped us find a path to God in a different way, in a deeper way. And this evening we have the huge privilege of welcoming Sister Gemma Simmonds, who is a sister of the Congregation of Jesus. And she is a senior lecturer in pastoral theology based at Margaret Beaufort Institute of Theology in Cambridge, where she is director of the Religious Life Institute. She lectured in Christian spirituality at Haythrop College until it closed in 2018, where she specialized in spiritual direction and in the Ignatian tradition. Sister Gemma is an international speaker. She's been a missionary in Brazil, chaplain at the universities of Cambridge and in London, as well as a volunteer chaplain in Holloway Prison for 26 years, which I clearly don't believe, Sister Gemma, you must have started there very young. She is a religious broadcaster and is a regular contributor on religious matters on the BBC. And her book, The Way of Ignatius, published by SBCK, the very best publisher there is on these things, for Lent 2019. And there is a new book out now, Treasuring God's Word, which is published by Pauline Books, which is, Pauline Books is kind of okay. And the link to purchase that book is on the website, Towers of Faith. Sister Gemma, no more from me. I hand over to you and look forward to listening to what you have to share with us this evening.
Unmute. Thank you very much, Father Matthew. And thank you also to all of you who are sitting out there listening. I do want to encourage you all, please, to, eat, drink, be generally as merry as you wish to be. I'm not watching what you're up to on your screen, and I hope nobody else is doing so too much either. But it matters that you should be at ease and comfortable. And I would thank you for spending the time, because in these lockdown days, there are many, many potential calls on our time and attention. It's always a great pleasure talking about somebody you feel you know well and that you love. I think perhaps for some of you, this may be an introduction to Ignatius. For others, I suspect that it may be a review of someone who is an old friend to you as well. But either way, I hope that this will be an introduction to somebody whose deepest desire was to invite people to know Christ better, to know Jesus. He was a Basque. People often describe him as a Spaniard, and I'm not sure how many of my Basque friends would entirely agree with that one, but he was definitely a Basque. And he really does bridge, he straddles the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern world, the new learning. And so he's a very interesting historical figure, because in his day, he lived at a time both of the disintegration of medieval Christendom and the emergence of all sorts of strands in Christianity that had hitherto been unknown. And he also lived, and this was very important to him and his companions, at the time of the opening up to what was known in Europe as the New World. As somebody who has lived in Latin America, of course, and in fact I was in Brazil at the time of the anniversary of the invasion of Latin America by Christopher Columbus, and everybody in the Northern Hemisphere was celebrating the discovery of the New World, or the discovery of Latin America, whereas the Latin Americans were saying, we weren't discovered, we were here already. It was an invasion. So I'm choosing my words carefully, but it was, for Europeans, the opening up of a completely new world, and the impact that had on their understanding of Christianity and of the Christian message. And of course, the impact it had on what is now known as Latin America. of the coming of people from the north and the coming of Christianity and the coming of European culture with it was an absolutely enormous thing. So Ignatius, a fascinating person who lived in a fascinating period. One of the things I want to do, if I may, is to share my screen with you, because my intention is to show some slides. I hope this is going to be okay for you, and that you will be able to see them all right. And this is where I'm going with all of this. And I do want to, please excuse me for a very short techno moment while I make sure that we see things from the beginning. I wonder if I could just have Alex Barrow. Could you give me a thumbs up if you can see? Thank you. Okay, thanks awfully. And how lovely it is to see you there, dear Alex. So, there are one or two phrases that are very much what you might call Ignatian speak. One of which is finding God in all things. And I don't want to paint a caricature of the spirituality of the medieval period or of the early church, but certainly there was a very considerable emphasis in all sorts of strands of the Christian spiritual tradition of seeking God in what was otherworldly, of seeking God in the things that were not of this world. We know, for instance, that the early monastic movements was based on the principle of the fuga mundi, the flight from the world, the flesh and the devil. And that in that respect, the seculum, the world, was seen as a place of darkness, a place of godlessness, and a place where people very easily got swept off their feet into concerns for money, for power, for pleasure, in all sorts of ways that took them away from the pure and simple gaze and contemplative gaze on God and on the things of God. Ignatius lived in the aftermath of the rise of the cities in the late medieval period. And he lived just at the moment where a number of European countries were beginning to vie with one another in order to be superpowers. He also lived at a time of an explosion of travel and movement and mobility across the world, an explosion of mercantile and commercial power and consumer activity, and an explosion of areas of knowledge that people had never had before or had very much lost sight of. If that sounds familiar to any of us as being remarkably similar to our own world, I think that we can think of Ignatius and the people of his time as confronted with many of the moral and intellectual and indeed spiritual dilemmas that are familiar to us in our day. And what is remarkable about Ignatius was that he did the very opposite of the fuga mundi. At the beginning of his pilgrimage, he did actually disappear from the world and went to live in a cave for a long period of time. But out of that solitude, out of that radical desert experience, he became ever more convinced that God is to be found actually at the heart of reality, at the heart of life as it is, rather than trying to avoid it. So Ignatius was a soldier, and he was very much the sort of blood or glory type of soldier. He was a soldier during the time of the wars between France and Spain. And during the siege of Pamplona, he was very badly wounded in the leg and was taken home as a wounded soldier, where he had truly grisly surgery. And he had long months of lying on his own in a room, bored to tears, trying to convalesce. And I love these shoes because they are actually Ignatius's own shoes. In those days, you didn't have left and right shoes. You just had the same shoe for each foot, and you kind of wore it into being left and right. But Ignatius at the time was walking nowhere. He lay flat on his bed, and he was a very avid reader of the blockbuster novels of his day, which were the romances, most of them deeds, tales of knightly daring do. You know, Don Quixote de la Mancha, very much inspired, in fact, turned off his head by reading too many of these romances. Well, Ignatius was a great romance reader too. And he asked his pious sister-in-law, Magdalena, if she had any of these romances for him to read. I suspect that Magdalena had been waiting for this moment for a long time with her wayward brother-in-law and said, no, actually, awfully sorry, no romances in the house, probably having stuffed them all in a cupboard somewhere and locked it. But we do happen to have the life of Christ and the lives of the saints. And Ignatius was so bored, he decided to pick those up. And as he began to read these stories, he realized something immensely important, that when he was reading the romances, the tales of fantasy, which always had the knight in shining armor getting the girl and killing the villain and doing great deeds of heroism, at the time of reading them, he felt very uplifted, he felt very excited, he felt very stimulated. But in the aftermath, afterwards, when he'd stopped reading the story, he felt empty. There wasn't anything that nourished him deeply. Whereas, although reading the lives of Christ, the life of Christ and the lives of the saints was nothing like as stimulating and exciting while he was doing the reading, he found that in the aftermath of reading those things, he felt as if he had had nourishment for his soul. His heart was set on fire. His imagination was set on fire. If Francis and Dominic and the great saints of old could do these things for Christ, why not me? Why couldn't I do these things? He had an experience of being attracted and called to do great deeds for Christ himself. And this realization, or the way he looked at and balanced his two reactions to reading, became the foundation of what is known in his spiritual exercises as the discernment of spirits. Ignatius is constantly saying, well, in the face of a particular experience, whatever experience it might be, whether it's being with somebody in a relationship, or your working life, or reading a text, or doing some study, or building a barn, or digging your garden, where are your desires? Where does your heart lie? And what's happening at the level of the heart, not only while you're doing this, but in the aftermath? Is it leading to an increase of faith, hope, and love in some sense? Or is it actually diminishing those things? Is it leading you to a focus on Christ? Or is it leading to an inward focus on yourself that actually narrows down the whole perspective, your whole horizon, and leads you fixated on the ego? And it was as a result of this experience that he decided to put on his shoes and go on pilgrimage, to walk all the way from his house in Loyola to Montserrat, the famous monastery near Barcelona of the Black Madonna. And that's just to give you a bit of an idea. It's a pretty long journey, you know, right across Navarra and Aragon and right across Catalonia, all of which were separate or had been separate kingdoms and were effectively foreign countries to him, until he gets to the monastery of Montserrat, where he does a vigil of arms in front of the Black Madonna and hands over all the paraphernalia of his night. A mouse can show you here a little place called Manresa, outside Montserrat, where he goes to be a hermit in a cave. Well, it all starts very well. He's very passionate. He's very devout. He's really wanting to hand over his life to Christ. But he kind of becomes a bit of a hippie. He lets his hair grow long. He gets all a bit scruffy and beardy and long nails, a bit like, you know, some of you of the male persuasion during lockdown, no doubt. And he also goes a bit mad. He finds that he gets desperately depressed and he becomes terribly focused on himself. And he has a sense of his own guilt, of his own, it's in odd sorts of ways. It's a very similar kind of experience to that of Martin Luther. Or he has a sense of not being saved, of never being able to be worthy. And at one point he says to God, send me someone, send me anybody. I would, even if you sent me a puppy dog, I would follow it. Well, God didn't send him a puppy dog. God sent him an elderly woman, a holy elderly granny figure of the area, who basically told Ignatius to get a wash, get a haircut, sort himself out, and listen to her. And she spoke to him out of her experience of the spiritual life, and especially of her experience of Christ being alive in her and in her own life, and of her conviction that Christ is alive in anybody who turns to him. And this was the beginning of Ignatius really finding the life of God within himself. Now, I've got a few quotations here. Two of them are definitely by St. Augustine, the top one and the bottom one. The middle one is attributed to St. Augustine, though I suspect it's of somewhat doubtful Augustinian provenance. However, it does seem to me to be fairly thoroughly Augustinian in what it says. So from the Confessions, you have made us for yourself, O God, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. To fall in love with God is the greatest of romances, to seek God the greatest adventure, to find God the greatest human achievement. And then from one of his sermons on the letter of John, the whole life of a good Christian is holy desire. What you desire you cannot see yet, but the desire gives you the capacity so that when it does happen that you see, you may be fulfilled. This is our life, to be exercised by desire. Now, I've put those things about desire in the bottom quotation in italics, really for emphasis. The desire gives you the capacity. I'd like to ask you just to sit with that thought for a moment. Effectively, what Ignatius is saying is that there is within each human person a God-shaped space, a space that only God can fill. And the more we inhabit that space of desire, the more, as it were, that space hollows out within us a greater space, a greater capacity for receiving the grace of God, for knowing Christ Jesus alive within us. This, he says, is our life, to be exercised by desire. Now, I know that we've all been told in this time of lockdown that the one thing we must do is take more exercise. And I have to say that's certainly been more honored in the breach than the observance where I'm concerned. But the thing about exercise is that it does stretch us. It does sometimes make us ache a bit in muscles that haven't had much use for a long time. It can leave us feeling as if we've done several rounds with Mike Tyson. But we do find that when we do exercise, we become more flexible, more supple. And there is something here in what Augustine is saying about the need for human beings to exercise, to stretch and open their capacity for desiring God. And that is what Ignatius understood. I'll cut short his biography just to say that after a number of adventures, he ends up in the most Augustinian university in the world at that time, namely the University of Paris. And it's just a historical matter of interest that Ignatius and John Calvin were students at the same university at the same time, and in fact did many of the same courses, but they obviously took the theology that they learned to very different conclusions. However, there is, I think, something deeply Augustinian in Ignatius, in particular his huge emphasis on desire, on developing our desires, on getting to know our desires, and on taking our deep desires seriously as being a place, perhaps the primary place, of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And out of his experience in the cave in Manresa, he eventually came to write down his understanding of a good way, a method, if you like, for people to come to know Jesus, to know him personally in the way that the people who actually met him in the flesh knew him. And so if desire is one of the great pillars of the Ignatian spiritual vision, the other is imagination. As I said to you, Ignatius was somebody who loved romances and who found it very easy to get lost in the imaginary world of the stories of knights in shining armor, etc. He found that he was able to use that capacity also when he read the Gospels. And so he was able to lose himself in the scenes that he was praying and contemplating with. He found that he could enter into the stable at Bethlehem, smell the hay and the animals, touch the fleeces of the sheep, serve Mary and Joseph, gaze in awe and wonder at the baby, and kiss his tiny feet. And all of this enabled him to have a sense that he was truly and genuinely in his own person meeting Jesus, meeting Mary and Joseph and all the people. He was one of the people there in the gospel. For Ignatius, the thing that mattered was to see that in the Gospels, whenever anybody met Jesus, whether it was a pagan philosopher or a Roman soldier or a collaborator with the occupying army, whether it was a prostitute or an innkeeper or a fisherman or whoever it might be, they never came away unchanged. They were always influenced, they were always transformed by their experiences of being companions of Jesus. And therefore, what he wanted to do was lead people by this same way of imaginative prayer and contemplation into those transformative encounters, so that in the here and now of his own century, and for us now in the here and now of the 21st century, we can meet Jesus in the same way. And his spiritual exercises, as they became called, he was very clear at the beginning that he calls a spiritual exercise anything at all that helps us to enter more deeply into the presence of God. So, you know, there will be as many different ways of doing this as there are people. And he wrote what is known in the Ignatian trade as the principle and foundation, which is one of his notes, one of his annotations in the spiritual exercises, which is like his kind of manifesto. It's like his mission statement, if you like. The human person is created to praise, reverence, and serve God our Lord, and by doing so to save his or her soul. All other things on the face of the earth are created for human beings in order to help them pursue the end for which they're created. I'm just going to give you a moment to have a rest from my voice and just to read those words for yourself again. he goes on. It follows from this that one must use other created things insofar as they help towards one's end, and free oneself from them insofar as they're obstacles to one's end. To do this, we need to make ourselves indifferent to all created things, provided the matter is subject to our free choice and there's no other prohibition. We have a bit of a difficulty in the English-speaking world with that word indifferent and indifference, because it so easily to us conveys, I don't give a damn. You know, am I bothered? Does my face look bothered? And that's absolutely not what Ignatius was talking about. Indiferencia in Spanish has really got a lot more to do with balance, with freedom, with sitting lightly to things. And there is something enormously important in what he's saying here, that we're invited to have a relationship with the whole of the rest of created reality that sits lightly to them, does not allow ourselves to become enslaved or ensnared. But equally, Ignatius is not laying down the law about, well, this has got to be a good thing, this has got to be a bad thing. And he goes on to clarify that. Thus, as far as we're concerned, we should not want health more than illness, wealth more than poverty, fame more than disgrace, a long life more than a short one, and similarly for all the rest. But what we should desire and choose only what helps us more towards the end for which we're created. Now, it has to be said, I think, for most people, if we met someone and said, you know, what is your ambition in life? What's your hope for your life? And they said, well, I'd really like to be ill, poor, and disgraced. That's really what I want for my life. Most of us would be searching through the yellow pages for the nearest psychiatrist for them. You know, it would be nuts to actively want those things. But what Ignatius is trying to get at is, we don't set our hearts on any one thing as being, that is the only thing that can make me happy. That is the only thing that can make me a good human being. That is the only thing that can lead me to God. And I think it's interesting, for instance, that I think some of us in the audience are probably old enough to remember Garret Fitzgerald, who was the Taoiseach of Ireland at one point, and Julius Nyerere, who was the first leader and president of independent Tanzania. Both of these men made the spiritual exercises before they took up office. And both of them came out of those spiritual exercises convinced that what God was actually inviting them to was to make use of their political power, to take up power. So they weren't canonizing humility in the sense of being lowly. And in the same way, there have been people who have stood, for instance, to administer or even inherit a very large fortune. It might be the case that they're being asked to turn away from this and to say, no, I don't want to be responsible for all that money. But it may be that God is actually inviting them to take up their responsibility for using that money wisely and well. And the same for fame, and the same for every other kind of advantage. Ignatius is not canonizing any aspect of life and saying that's definitely the path to God for everyone. And he would say the same in the exercises with regard, for instance, to marriage over celibacy, or priesthood over the lay life, or monastic life over mother or fatherhood. In each of these ways of life, he would be saying, God can be found. What matters is that you get to know yourself well enough to know what God is inviting you in particular to. And the other big thing, the other big bit of Ignatian speak I want to look at is he talks later on in the exercises about people being contemplatives in action. And what does he mean by that? Well, there's a Jesuit theologian called Walter Burkhardt, an American, who talks about contemplation as taking a long, loving look at the real. But before I can take that long look of love at anyone or anything else, I have to allow God to take a long, loving look at me. So being a contemplative means learning how to see, how to be attentive and to be present to the possibility of grace wherever I am and whatever I am doing. Not to be fixated on a sort of private little religious world, and it's here and only here that I can find God. Teresa of Avila talked famously at one point about God can be found among the pots and pans. And Ignatius is saying something very similar, because if we narrow down our vision, if we narrow down our horizon, our religious horizon and our spiritual horizon, only to things which are of the formally spiritual type, we risk neither seeing nor hearing the God who is present in everyday created reality. As Matthew says in chapter 13, verse 13, seeing they see not, and hearing they hear not. Something which I discovered in Thomas Merton, the American 20th century Trappist monk's writings. Merton was not by any means Ignatian. He wasn't a Jesuit, and he opted for a very different form of religious life, that of a Trappist monk in a silent monastery in America. But he says this about prayer, and I find it very similar to what Ignatius is trying to say. In prayer, we discover what we already have. You start from where you are and you deepen what you already have, and you realize you're already there. We already have everything, but we don't know it and don't experience it. Everything has been given to us in Christ. All we need is to experience what we already possess. So Ignatius is saying that the journey, the pilgrim journey that all of us are called and invited to, is the journey within, and the journey to discover the God who lives in me, and to learn how to recognize God in me. There's a quotation that I love. It's from the final chapter of the English mystical text, The Cloud of Unknowing, where the author says, it's not what you are, nor what you have been, but what you want to be that God sees with merciful eyes. We're back to desire again. Not what you are, nor what you have been, but what you want to be. And I think if we were to put this in 21st century terms, we would be able to say that prayer is not a performance-related activity. I don't know about you, but I'm immensely grateful for that. God sees our deepest desires, and God operates at the level of our deepest desires. And it's for us not only to discover what we want, what we really, really want, but also to discover what obscures those desires, or what distorts those desires, or what desires cloud the really profound desires that are in our hearts. And Ignatius, who knew a thing about this from his own life, said, you know, whenever we become obsessed with the desire for riches, for honor, for vainglory, for power of some sort or another, that tends to distort our vision. And we need to get underneath those peripheral desires in order to find the desires that are at the deepest part of our human life. And so even if we discover that our relationship with God is a struggle, if we find ourselves like Jacob at the ford of Jabbok, wrestling with God, the challenge is to allow God to reveal to us who we are, reflected in God's loving gaze. You may remember that at one point Jacob says to the angel, "I will not let you go unless you tell me who you are." And basically the angel says, "I will not tell you who I am, but I will tell you who you are." And so in the process of the spiritual exercises, the prayer is for us to begin to see ourselves as God sees us, both in terms of the stark reality of our sinfulness and our poverty and our fragility, but also in the light of God's amazement at what God has created, that God looks in us at what God has made and finds it very, very good. And it's only once we are able to see that, to see ourselves in the reality of our sinfulness and our poverty, that we begin to be able to see others as God sees them. So the first week of the exercises is, first of all, a discovery of the wonder of our creation. I thank you for the wonder of my being, for the wonders of all creation. And one spends time experiencing one's own createdness and the marvel of all created reality. But you can't spend long thinking about created reality without realizing that something's gone badly wrong. Things aren't as they should be. We would only have to think about what's going on in Amazonia at the moment, or we only have to think about the link that many scientists are making between the COVID virus and our insane consumption of the world's non-renewable resources, of a lifestyle that is completely out of control and that is to the massive disadvantage of the vast majority of the world. Once we start to contemplate the wonders of creation, we come fairly starkly up against the horror of sin and the divided heart of humankind, my own and that of the whole of human nature. And Ignatius wants us to look at this not so that we can wallow in some ghastly Wagnerian sense of our turpitude and our unworthiness, but precisely so that by knowing the reality of our sinfulness, we come to a very deep and very real experience of amazing grace. You might remember that moment in the Gospels, in the house of Simon the leper, when the woman who has a bad name in the town comes in and weeps all over Jesus's feet and wipes them with her hair, and all the men are tut-tutting. Well, if he were really a prophet, he'd know what kind of a woman this is. And Jesus reproaches them and says to them, her sins, her many sins, must have been forgiven, or she would not have loved so much. And by implication, he also looks at the lack of love or the lack of warmth and courtesy with which he was greeted in Simon's house. And he sees that as being the result of somebody who has never really confronted his own weakness in the way that this woman has. And the woman is blessed not because she's miserable about her sins, but because she has come to a realization, a heartbreaking realization of the amazing grace and gift that she's been given of God's love and forgiveness. So the whole purpose of the first week is to know ourselves as loved and forgiven sinners so that we can also look at others with the same gaze. And that contemplative glimpse becomes an instinctive recognition, as in the moment at the supper in Emmaus, where the disciples, for a moment, a second, see Jesus, see him as he is, recognize who he is, and then he disappears. And as they say afterwards, didn't our hearts burn within us? So they see him and they know it's him because they have the affective response, the evidence of their affective response, their hearts burning. So for Ignatius, there is, if you like, a trajectory between desire, imagination, encounter, and affective response. And it's that trajectory in our prayer that brings us close to Christ and brings us close to the whole of God's dynamic relational life in the Trinity. As we contemplate God, Father, Son, and Spirit, and allow ourselves to be drawn into the Trinity's gaze, we find ourselves living in a dynamic relationship of love, but also of mission. So there is a very key contemplation in the spiritual exercises where Ignatius imagines the three persons of the Trinity kind of sitting around looking down on earth as spectator sport and seeing what we're all up to. Some people dying and some being born, some people getting married, some people committing murder, people buying and selling and yelling and shouting and laughing and crying and all that stuff. And they say, basically, what are we going to do about all these people? Look at them. And the second person of the Trinity says, I will go. If you're familiar with the wonderful poem by R.S. Thomas, The Coming, it really embodies Ignatius's contemplation on the Trinity, on the incarnation, and I would warmly recommend it. So we move from there into looking at what kind of a world does Jesus come into? Well, he came into a world of blood and violence almost from the first moment he was born, a world of poverty, of inequality, of oppression. And to be honest, things haven't got an awful lot better. If Jesus's world was a world out of balance, well, so is ours, where we now possess the creative and the destructive powers that are global in scope. A world of massive, massive inequality. We are living in a world of crisis, a crisis that is personal, socio-economic, and ecological. And I've read so many things of people saying, well, perhaps the COVID virus is a wake-up call. Well, am I not sorry that it took a global zootic virus to bring us to our senses? And am I sure that we will be brought to our senses? Well, let's say I'm not holding my breath right now. And what are the options for us in our world that the incarnation of Christ calls us to? Well, we could refuse to change. We could refuse to redefine our understanding of who and what we are. Or we could mature into a more whole and integrated way of living together and with the rest of life on earth. That seems to be the most urgent call now. And it is the call to which Christ certainly implicitly invited us. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And what is God's will on earth? But that the earth should be the place of joy and wholeness and fullness of life that he created it to be. We are being invited to open ourselves to a more expansive and inclusive vision for ourselves and the world, and to grow in the way we see and feel about everything, to perceive differently so that we begin to act differently. So all the way through the spiritual exercises, the more we walk with Jesus, the more we go with him along the path of his own life, his own childhood in Nazareth, the beginnings of his ministry as he calls his disciples, as he calls people to the kingdom, his ministries of healing and teaching and preaching. We are being invited to perceive differently, to be transformed, so that we, in our turn, can become transformed transformers. I want to quote a little. I'm going to offer you several quotations here from the first and only ever Jesuit Pope, who is very thoroughly Ignatian in what he has to say. So in his text, The Joy of the Gospel, Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis says, "I invite all Christians everywhere at this very moment to a renewed personal encounter with Jesus Christ, or at least an openness to letting him encounter them. The Lord doesn't disappoint those who take this risk. Whenever we take a step towards Jesus, we come to realize that he's already there, waiting for us with open arms." So the invitation is to a personal encounter with Jesus in a way that helps us to understand how we are part of a created reality, which is in itself a sacrament with a small s, a sign which makes real what it signifies. The whole of creation is a sign of God's abiding presence. And if we can learn to understand and enter more deeply into that sacramental mystery of created reality, we will grow closer to an understanding of Jesus's vision of the kingdom fulfilled. I want to share with you something that was written by an astronaut. He was one of the first people to actually view the Earth from the moon, from another planet altogether. You know, ours is the first generation to have ever seen that. And using, I have to say, rather a robust American language, this is what he says about it. When you look at the Earth from the moon, you develop an instant global consciousness, a people orientation, an intense dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and a compulsion to do something about it. From out there on the moon, international politics look so petty. You want to grab a politician by the scruff of the neck and drag him 250,000 miles out and say, "Look at that, you son of a bitch." Now, if that's how an astronaut, Edgar Mitchell, how his perception was shifted by taking the long view of looking at the world, looking at the Earth from the moon, we're being asked to make the same seismic shift as well by Ignatius through our encounter with Jesus Christ, which becomes transformative, so that we are being invited to become other Christs, to become Christ in the world, to shoulder the burdens of others, and to walk with him on his route to the cross, to shoulder the cross with him, and to know what it is, to feel ourselves, to experience ourselves as saved, in order that we might also participate in his saving mission. We're asked to contemplate the crucified Jesus, to enter into his wounds, to touch his wounds, so that we can become able to recognize the wounded Christ all around us. Again, from The Joy of the Gospel, Pope Francis, an evangelizing community gets involved by word and deed in people's daily lives. It bridges distances. It's willing to abase itself if necessary, and it embraces human life, touching the suffering flesh of Christ in others. Evangelizers thus take on the smell of the sheep, and the sheep are willing to hear their voice. As a Jesuit, Pope Francis is very keen on this kind of incarnational stance towards the world, that we really get stuck in to the reality of other people's lives in the way that Jesus Christ incarnate also got stuck in to human reality. He goes on to say, Jesus wants us to touch the suffering flesh of others. He hopes that we'll stop looking for those personal or communal niches which shelter us from the maelstrom of human misfortune and instead enter into the reality of other people's lives and know the power of tenderness. And I love the casual way in which Pope Francis goes on to say, whenever we do so, our lives become wonderfully complicated and we experience intensely what it is to be a people, to be part of a people. So Ignatius invites us not only to walk as companions with Jesus, to walk on the road with him, to be with him, to contemplate him closely and lovingly, but also to be alongside the people whose lives he touches, those whom he meets in the Gospels, and those whom he invites us to meet day by day. He invites us to see reality, to see the divine meaning within reality. Part of the difficulty, I think, for Christians is that we can very easily allow our vision of the world to become very sacralized and very dichotomized. We can see very much a split between the sacred and the secular. This is the holy bit of my life. This is my ordinary life. This is what I do 6 days of the week, and this is what I do on Sundays. So, you know, at Easter, we hear very much, and we go to church and we listen to these scriptures all about the parting of the Red Sea and the Exodus and God's salvific act in bringing the people to the promised land. We can understand that. But can we also see the Exodus? Can we also see a religious meaning when we see this? We look at the Pietà, we look at any image of Mary holding the body of her dead son in her arms, and we have a deep sense of a religious truth. We look at the fact of Jesus washing the feet of his disciples, and we think what a wonderful and powerful image that is. But what about when we are confronted with those whose feet we are asked to wash and touch? Can we see the suffering flesh of Christ in the suffering flesh of others? This is also a Pietà. This photograph was taken in Darfur in the refugee camp, a few hours after this girl's baby died of starvation. The Mater Dolorosa is all around us. This is not politics, this is faith. And Ignatius is trying to help us to have an integrated vision of the divine realities, the sacramental realities within lived reality. At Christmas, it's very easy for us to see the baby in its mother's arms and to understand that this is God with us. But this is also God with us. And the same urgent necessity to respond to God with us here calls us, as it calls us to respond to God with us here. These are faith demands. You may remember the story of Francis of Assisi when at one point during the Mass, the host was elevated, and instead of seeing the consecrated host, instead of seeing the body of Christ in a piece of bread, what he saw was the child Jesus in the flesh. It's very easy, I think, for us to turn the sacraments into sacred stuff, far removed from the reality of ordinary life. And yet this is also the body of Christ. And you may remember when this picture went viral all over the world, when this little 5-year-old Syrian boy was washed up dead on the shore as his family tried to flee to freedom. This too is the body of Christ. So what is Ignatius inviting us to? He is inviting us to become contemplatives in action by a deeper entry into an intimate personal relationship of encounter with Jesus Christ in the Gospels, in the Scriptures, in the world as we find it. He is inviting us to become transformed transformers and agents of active hope. At the very end of his letter, The Joy of the Gospel, this is what Pope Francis writes: "My mission of being in the heart of the people is not just a part of my life or a badge I can take off. It's not an extra or just another moment in life. Instead, it's something I cannot uproot from my being without destroying my very self. I am a mission on this earth. That's the reason why I'm here in this world. We have to regard ourselves as sealed, even branded by this mission of bringing light, blessing, enlivening, raising up, healing, and freeing." Dear friends, for Ignatius, we do not have a mission. We are a mission. And that is a wonderful thing, because I think for many of us in these days of lockdown, we perhaps have felt rather useless. We've been cut off from many of the things that we do habitually, all the doing for God. And although that doing is of immense importance, and please God, there will come a day when we are able to go out again and do what we do for Christ. What's being suggested here is that it's as important, if not more important, that we be who we are for Christ, and that who we are is a mission in and of itself. I am a mission on this earth. That is the heart of Ignatius's vision. It's the heart of what we find in the spiritual exercises. It's a whole trajectory, and I could say a great deal more, but what I would recommend if you've never made an Ignatian retreat is that you have a go. And there are lots and lots of Ignatian retreats going on online at this very moment. And the person you will meet, of course, is Jesus himself, waiting for you with open arms. What you will find yourself drawn into is that dynamic life of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit, whose very nature is relationship. And like the disciples on the road to Emmaus, you will find your hearts burning within you. Did we not recognize him in the Scriptures and in the breaking of bread? I want to end, if I may, with a text written by or attributed to William Wilberforce. Many of you may be saying to yourselves, well, it's all very well, you know, this kind of high-flown stuff, but, you know, who am I to go out and transform the world? Well, if I can remind you that in the 18th century, there were only two people in the whole of England who believed in the abolition of slavery. One was William Wilberforce, a member of Parliament, and the other was John Newton, the former slave trader who was the author of Amazing Grace. And it started with two, and it ended up with the entire abolitionist movement and the abolition of slavery. So big things can happen when people decide to get off the ground and get moving. And I'd like to invite you, wherever you are, to say this with me and listen to it as something for yourself, as a message for yourself. Things great have small beginnings. Every downpour is just a raindrop. Every fire is just a spark. Every harvest is just a seed. Every journey is just a step, because without that step, there will be no journey. Without that raindrop, there can be no shower. Without that seed, there can be no harvest. Glory be to God, whose power working in us can do infinitely more than we could ask or imagine. Glory be to him in the church and in Christ Jesus, forever and ever. Amen. Dear friends, thank you very much for your attention. It was good to talk. What I'd like to invite you to do is maybe spend a bit of time, go and get yourself a cup of tea or whatever. Just think about what sits with me, what's stayed with me, whether it's an image or some words or something I've said. There may be questions for you, or there may be just things that you would like to share and comment on. You're very free, and I will leave it. I don't know if it's Father Matthew or Father Sam or Father Chris or whoever it is, will kind of be the referee. But please feel free to respond, to raise questions, or just to kind of quietly go away if you feel you've been talked out.
Can I ask a question?
Please do.
I just wondered what the impact of living in Brazil was on you, Gemma. How were you before you went, and how were you when you came away?
Okay, before I went, I think I was full of good intentions and goodwill. But you know, I'm a girl from North London who had a very privileged education, and then entered a very smart convent in a very beautiful part of leafy Berkshire, where I then for 10 years taught the daughters of very good and splendid and very wealthy people. And although we did a great deal of work on justice and the like, I had never personally experienced radical poverty. And I did experience a call to go and do that. I felt there was something I needed to learn. And off I went, and it was just one of God's little quirks. You know, I find that God has a quirky sense of humor, that I ended up flying to the one country in Latin America where I didn't speak the language, because at the time I had no Portuguese at all. So from the beginning, I experienced my own poverty of not being able to kind of control my environment through words, which is, as a teacher, something I was used to doing, because I didn't have any words. And I very soon engaged in working in a favela, and I had never seen or touched or, God knows, smelled anything like it in my life. And it was an almighty shock. But it was also one of the most powerful experiences I have ever had of having the gospel preached to me. You know, I thought in my innocence that I was going out there, you know, to preach the gospel to the poor. You know, no kidding. Because I've no idea whether I did anything for anybody out there that was of any mortal use whatsoever. But what I do know is that the poor preached the gospel to me in a way that I had never had it preached before. And it was like a 360-degree seismic change. And you know, it's a bit like Edgar Mitchell looking at the moon, at the Earth from the moon. You know, once you've seen it, you can never unsee it. Never again. So yeah, it was huge, huge.
Before we move to Father Sam, who's going to compare the rest of the questions, Sister Gemma, I just want to say thank you so much for that incredible talk that you've given us on Ignatius. I speak as somebody who knows very little about him, beyond having visited Rome a couple of times and seen the great churches and the shrines, of course. But I know very little else, and I'm so grateful to you, as I'm sure we all are, for having brought him very much to life, I think, in a truly Ignatian way, enabling us to actually really enter into his thought and his context, his life, and the experiences that gave him his vocation and that inspired him to begin the movement that bears his name. I think finding God in all things was kind of the strapline of this evening, and I really do think that with what you've said, we've all had a fantastic encouragement to really take that to heart and just to explore that a bit further. And in this time of lockdown, it was certainly for me a real encouragement to just try to encounter God in perhaps in the small things, and in this time where we're a lot more limited in our ability to go out and be busy. So thank you so much for that. I'm now gonna hand over to Father Sam, who is gonna compare the rest of the questions.
Thank you very much. If you do have a question that you'd like to ask, then please do either give me a wave or some kind of symbol on the screen. I think you can do these thumbs up things or these various different reaction things on the new updated Zoom. So I'll scroll across and try and make sure I can see who is doing any of those. John.
I've got a little notice from Father Miles. Thank you, Father Miles. Thank you.
I think John Hillman's got a little thumbs up there. Have you got a question?
Yeah. Thank you. As a new ordinand, I'm rereading Julian of Norwich for a current essay, and I'm also doing Ignatian Spirituality as one of the modules. And I'm struck that she also says God is in everything. Is there a likelihood that there's some cross-fertilization, or he would have seen her work as she's what, about 100 years before him or something like that?
Yeah, I very much doubt it. I very much doubt that particular text, because I wouldn't know if it was translated into Spanish. I know that it was actually the 17th century that we get a kind of modern English version.
Yeah.
So I would somehow doubt it, but of course, although Julian says, she's an unlettered woman and all of that, actually there's evidence that she wasn't that unlettered, and that she certainly would have possibly taken in via the clergy of her time a whole mystical tradition and a spiritual tradition that very much confirmed God in everything. But I think it's also part of her genius that she really did also have the famous hazelnut, have that very deep sense of God holding the whole of creation. So I think they had a very similar vision, both of them, of really wanting to affirm deeply the godliness of all reality. I think that's where they have a bridge between them both.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anna Matthews has put a hand up. Go to Anna Matthews.
Oh, hello, Anna.
Hello.
Hi. Nice to see you.
And you. I have really benefited from Ignatian prayer and spirituality and direction myself, and have tried to encourage it in others. One of the things I sometimes come up against with people is a mistrust of imagination and desire. Sometimes because they've been formed in tradition which tells them that that's how Satan gets in. What's your advice for helping people to embark on that kind of a journey of trust?
Well, I think I would want to say, you know, it's a very, very old tradition that goes back to the Psalms of, you know, Lord, teach me your ways, you know, and the Psalms are full of a desire to have a heart for God, or to have God's desires implanted in one. I think, you know, if we can help people, I think people with that sort of a discourse will tend to trust Scripture, you know. And I think to help them to trust the Scriptures, which talk about, you know, godly desires or having a desire, and to look at the way that Jesus talks about, you know, I have longed with great longing, I have desired with a great desire, you know, to eat this Passover with you. And I think also that there is one of the things that I think makes Ignatian prayer so adaptable is precisely its I mean, Joyce Huggett wrote a very interesting article on this in The Way journal, which can be found online, why Ignatian spirituality appeals to Protestants. And it's precisely because he lays such emphasis on Scripture, you know. And I think one has to be fairly kind of upfront with people and say, okay, yes, like any very finely tuned instrument, you know, you can either play a wonderful tune on a Stradivarius, or you can play something that's absolutely ear-splitting. It's up to the way you use it. We can use our imagination. Our imagination is incredibly powerful. Whenever anyone says to me, oh, I've got no imagination, I say, can you remember the last time you went to the dentist? And they go, ouch. And I say, well, what's that if not your imagination? Because you're not at the dentist now. You're just in your imagination going back. You're reliving that experience. And it's a powerful experience of ouch. So, you know, it is a human capacity. And like all human capacities, we can use it for good or ill. Now, you know, which do you choose? In a sense, I suppose I find it a little bit of a dereliction of responsibility to blame imagination itself. It's a bad workman who blames his tools. It's the use we decide to put to imagination. And Jesus was always inviting people to use their imagination. What are his parables but an invitation to imagine, you know, a man who goes on a long journey, and, you know, or a merchant who goes and finds a fine pearl. Jesus himself invites us to imagine things, and in doing so brings us closer to the truth of God. So I would get back with their own tools, I'm afraid. You know me, Anna, I tend to give as good as I get on the whole.
I think Mark Bryan waved a hand.
Hello, Mark. You're muted, Mark. You have to unmute. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I would also put myself in the place of somebody who's been immensely, you know, immense gratitude to Ignatius and everybody. Very taken with Greg Boyle's work in Los Angeles, and everything we hear about Ignatius is about God's love. And since Easter, or around Easter, we're reading all this stuff about the Exodus, and God is just zapping people left, right, and center. You know, at the Easter Vigil, we basically sing, you know, isn't it wonderful that the Red Sea has come over the Egyptians and all their chariots. Do you have any sense as to what Ignatius would have made of all this?
If I can go at a slight tangent, I'm very conscious that when the Jews celebrate Passover, and when the Jews celebrate and reenact Haggadah, they say we cannot rejoice completely on this night because the Egyptians died. You know, that's embedded in Judaism and in its prayers actually during the Passover. So the Jews themselves have embedded in their liturgy a sort of a capacity of compassion and thinking with and feeling with the other. And for Ignatius, you know, the other of his childhood, of the Spain of his childhood, was by and large the Muslim. And there is a kind of tragicomic story in his own biography of him coming across a Muslim who blasphemed against the Mother of God. And Ignatius decides he's got to go back, and for the honor of Mary, he's got to kill this Muslim. And he's not quite sure whether he should or not. So eventually he allows his donkey to make the decision at the crossroads, whether his donkey takes a road that takes him to the Muslim, in which case he'll kill him, or takes him somewhere else. And the sensible donkey takes him in the opposite direction. And we see the kind of the young Ignatius, you know, being, if you like, a son of his own culture and of his own worldview. But later on, particularly when he's writing to his men, to the Jesuits, about how they should encounter people who are ill-disposed towards them, their enemies, as it were, or how they should deal with Protestants, because, you know, some of Ignatius's own first companions were sent as theologians to the Council of Trent. And there were debates there with the great Protestant theologians of the time. Ignatius is characterized not only by courtesy and charity, which he very much insists on, but also at the same time that he was absolutely and fully convinced of the truth of his own religious stance, as it were. He was also very aware of the capacity of this other who thought other than he did, the godliness of that person and of the goodwill within them. So I think there was a sense of his sharing God's compassion and God's honor for everyone that was created. I don't know if that entirely answers what you're asking, but I think the idea of Ignatius as the sort of the sword-waving kind of gung-ho leader of the Counter-Reformation is a real caricature, actually. His sensitivity in dealing with you know, those who were perceived as the enemy was quite remarkable in the culture of his time. And so I think he would have been much more inclined to a God who dealt with people, you know, with compassion rather than slaughtering all the enemies, you know.
So what would he have made of the Exodus story?
I think he would probably have seen it. I would need to go back, in a sense, and look at what kind of exegesis there was around the time. But given that in Ignatius's time, there certainly was quite a lot of allegorical exegesis, I think he would have seen the Egyptians not so much as, you know, the Egyptian people historically, but as representing, if you like, ungodliness or false idolatry, the placing of the power of the Pharaoh in the place of the power of God. And in that respect, you know, as an ex-soldier, he was quite gung-ho about fighting Satan. But I think that he had a reasonably sophisticated understanding of what that actually meant. And as far as we are aware, we see very often, particularly in that first generation of Jesuits, for instance, them very much trying to counterbalance the bloodthirsty tactics of the early conquistadors in South America, you know, and having a real sense of the godliness of you know, people who were very, very different. I don't think he would have gone for a murderous God in that respect.
Thank you very much.
Angela Rayner's got her hand up.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello, Angela.
Hello. Hi. You've spoken a great deal this evening, very helpfully, about Ignatius' focus on desire and embracing those things which help us to praise or reverence God. And then you've spoken also about indifference, about praying for God's will such that one's desire is detached from things, people, experiences. And I wonder sometimes how these fit together. How does one identify or help others identify what are the desires which are good and what are the desires that need to be let go of? And I suppose this is a question especially where people are sort of tending towards perceiving that freedom might lie in areas or matters where maybe church teaching is quite ambivalent.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, you know, he, for instance, in the Principle and Foundation, he does have that proviso. I just want to go, if I can, back to, yes. To do this, we need to make ourselves indifferent to all created things, provided the matter is subject to our free choice and there is no other prohibition. So even in the Principle and Foundation, you know, he is saying this isn't just a free for all. You know, there is such a thing as the teaching of the church. There is such a thing as, you know, moral teaching. There is such a thing as the proclamation of the gospel, and things that are not consistent in that respect with the gospel. You know, the rules for discernment of spirits within the exercises are quite subtle. And particularly, I mean, I tend, you know, in a very short lecture, I cannot go into this in huge detail, but I would, you know, always be saying, does this actually bring you to a deeper faith, hope, and love? And I would tend not to detach faith and hope from love. Because, you know, people can say, oh, well, of course it leads me to a greater love. You know, I love Susie, and the fact that I'm married to Maria is neither here nor there. You know, Susie's the one for me now, and tough luck on Maria. Well, you know, how does that fit in with your faith in a church that, you know, proclaims the sanctity of marriage, for instance, or whatever it may be? And I think, you know, the idea of indifference is not so much, it's not about detachment from feelings. It is, as I said before, it's about balance, I suppose, balance and freedom. And is this leading me to a deeper commitment to the Christian faith in all its fullness? Or is it leading me to say, well, you know, I'm going to do a kind of pick and choose, a pick and mix on the old Christianity thing. And well, I can go along with 90% of it, but there's just this thing about, you know, having several wives that I kind of rather fancy, or, you know, whatever it may be, or, you know, making money in illegitimate ways. Well, God's not going to worry too much about that. In what way is that consistent with a deeper faith? It's not consistent. And I think the Ignatian examen would, on a daily basis, that's why I think Ignatius suggests that we make it a part of our prayer, would actually face us pretty starkly with the incoherence of those kinds of statements and those kinds of attitudes. So it is a very good litmus test. And as we know, Ignatius, I mean, there are various rules in the exercises, one set of which is called Rules for Thinking with the Church. And actually the Spanish is Rules for Feeling with the Church, because sentir in Spanish, it both means thinking, but it also means feeling. And I think if there's any way in which the Ignatian tradition is at risk of being distorted in the 21st century, it's when it is principally peddled as part of the kind of self-help industry that's all about me and my growth and my personal, you know, what have yous. Well, you know, Ignatius would never see a person as an individual solely in their own right. He always sees people as part of the community of the faith or of the community of the human race, and therefore as belonging to something where we can't separate ourselves from one another. And I think that's part of the balancing act that we're called to, really. Does that help, Angela? Does that make sense, do you think?
I think it does in part, but I think it's very clear with the obvious examples when the desires are very, very deeply at odds, and one can say, oh, that's simply not thinking with the mind of the church. But for example, somebody that was, that was married, that felt deeply called into the religious life, or somebody that was in the religious life but felt called to marriage, where there isn't a clear, there would be obviously a need to work with somebody and to encourage them to keep whatever form of vows they're in. But there is also a kind of sense in which I think, or I've come across people who are kind of articulating two things that are just sort of incompatible, and I suppose that's the question. I think maybe there's not an answer, but that is what you could just say.
I think there isn't. I think what Ignatius in the end would say is, where is your deepest desire to serve God? And are you willing to be led by God? And if, you know, all other considerations are equal and you cannot make a clear decision, are you willing to be led by, let's say, the teaching of the church? Now, I mean, I've certainly had myself to accompany people who are in the process of choosing to leave one form of commitment because they've discerned that it's right for them to do so. And sometimes, whether one thinks that's right or wrong, one simply has to let them go ahead because, you know, you can't make their minds up for them. I think the one thing we can do is to try our best to prevent them from kind of co-opting God onto the side of a choice that is that appears not to be very godly. But, you know, I've certainly known people who have left the priesthood or left the religious life. And in the long term, it does seem to have been the right thing for them to have done. So I would sit very lightly myself as a spiritual director to attempting to tell people what they should do. And I think we have to, we do sometimes come to places where we simply have to trust that this is in God's hands, you know. It's as you say, there's no easy answer to that.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Sister Gemma? There's no hands up at the bottom, but is anyone waving at me that I can't see?
Or it may not be a question. You know, if somebody's got something they wish to throw into the pot, as it were, I'd be very interested and willing to hear it. Thanks, Tasha. I think it's possibly supper time for people who haven't had any supper.
Indeed. Well, thank you once again for joining us this evening and for giving us such a rich talk and giving us your time to answer those questions as well. I did such a hideous job last week of advertising that I advertised the wrong lecture, but I can now safely say that next week's lecture is on St. Augustine by Kirsty Borthwick, who is actually here with us this evening, I think. Yes, she is. So do tune in next week for that one, same time and same place. as we learn more about Augustine and his invitation to us to pray. But once again, Sister Gemma, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us on a safe journey home.
Thank you.